Morning. I'm Jane Beswick, and I am the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Group, and we're thrilled to have our speaker today, Reverend Dr. Jim Sherblom, who's a longtime Concord resident and local historian. Jim's mother, Ray Sherblom, lived right here at Newbury Court for a dozen years in the early 2000s. Jim holds a bachelor's degree in American history from Yale College, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and a master's in divinity and doctorate in ministry from Andover Newton Theological School, now Andover Newton at Yale Divinity School. And we're happy to hear about the history of incarceration in Concord.
So that's another way of saying I managed to spend 22 years in school. How a community treats its misfits, its addicts, the mentally ill, the criminally inclined, and the social discontents says a great deal about the nature of that community. Law and order often overwhelms kindness and care as virtues. Incarceration in a jail, reformatory, or prison is often a critical component of a society's law enforcement. Of course, who goes to prison, for how long, and under what conditions varies greatly across societies and reflects societal divisions, social hierarchies, and priorities. Large discrepancies between overall rates of incarceration and who among society's subpopulations are imprisoned can reflect a systemic bias in our judicial and/or policing policies. That has changed dramatically over the centuries, and it's worth paying attention to what Concord and Massachusetts and the United States are choosing as our policies and our choices of how we interact with each other. Major Simon Willard was Concord's first law enforcement officer, also chief magistrate, also the land surveyor, also the judge. Roles that he played from 1637 to 1659 before he acquired large estates from the indigenous people further west and moved further west. Willard groomed William Buttrick as his sergeant-at-arms, and when Willard moved west, Buttrick became Concord's first Middlesex County deputy sheriff. A powerful position as the king's representative in Concord, policing crime, collecting debts, and running the local jail or workhouse. The deputy sheriff was the town's legal and political infrastructure. Think what you've heard about Robin Hood. It's that kind of environment that initially was here. One single person as sheriff or deputy sheriff had enormous authority to decide what happens to the poor and oppressed. This began to change in the early 18th century as Concord became the judicial and administrative center after the American Revolution of Middlesex County, bringing Middlesex law courts, lawyers, judges, and accused lawbreakers into Concord Center. Increasingly, Concord's small jail became temporary housing for drunks and debtors. In 1755, it also included 8 French-Canadian Roman Catholic soldiers who had been captured in the Battle of Nova Scotia. And when they were served their time, they were told they could settle in Concord at the war's end. So the first Catholics to come to Concord was a result of the war in Nova Scotia in the middle 18th century. The American Revolution brought massive inflation, which resulted in many Concord farmers going bankrupt and losing everything they had, which led to Shays' Rebellion and to a widening gap between the top of society and its bottom half. If you haven't heard about Shays' Rebellion, this is more Concord people who are farmers and local merchants who were incarcerated at that point than any other percentage time in history. And this was immediately following the American Revolution. By the end of the 18th century, the rich got even richer, and the poor often went to jail. Abel Moore became deputy sheriff of Middlesex County in the first half of the 19th century, forcing the incarcerated poor to work off their debts through improving Concord Center and his estate. The mill pond was dredged and drained by prison labor. By the mid-1820s, Concord's stone jail held 180 inmates for varying terms, often days or months, every year. This at the time represented 6% of Concord's population. with debtors outnumbering criminals 2-1. It meant that if you were in the bottom half of Concord society, chances were greater than not that you would spend some part of your life in the jail as a way to enforce this social hierarchy. By the 1830s, Concord began developing its banking, financial, and insurance structure as the town moved towards a money-based capitalist economy. Burglaries became common enough to prompt Concord society for detecting rogues and thieves. Until they had all these transients coming through, they didn't feel like they needed to police against rogues and thieves, but now with the transients here, they did. Captain Daniel Smith, a Grand Master of the Concord Masonic Lodge, was convicted of passing out-of-state counterfeit banknotes and sentenced to 5 years in the state prison in Charlestown. They introduced bank mortgages and loans secured by one's real property, which created new possibilities for farmers and landowners to expand their lands. However, such loans were financially risky, and many Concord farmers again went bankrupt, losing their farms in the Panic of 1837. We need to remember that this was a recurring theme, where the society would expand, then it would go through a recession of some sort, and many of the poor would be pushed off the edge of being able to be self-sustaining and end up in jail. It wasn't until 1865 that Concord had its first bank robbery. Two former Confederate soldiers, Langdon Moore and Harry Howard, were skulking around Concord Center. When the bank was opened, its front door key always hung next to the door so that it could easily lock up at the end of the day, and Harry swiped it. He went and had it copied by a willing blacksmith and returned it back apparently completely unnoticed. Langton observed where the chief cashier, John Cheney, hid his vault key, which was his next level of security. He hid it in his drawer when he went home for lunch in case he got tired and didn't get back in time when they needed to reopen the vault. So Moore hid behind the graves in the southern burying ground until he saw Cheney go home to lunch, and he and Howard took the $300,000, equivalent to $6 million today, from the bank safe. This was the entire working capital of the town of Concord at the time. However, as everyone recognized them as strangers in town, they were soon captured. One made it as far as Boston, the next as far as New Jersey. But now having telegraphs, they were able to send the description of these two strangers out ahead of them. And so when they stopped in someplace where there was a telegraph station, they could be pre-seen and arrested on sight. Henry David Thoreau's prominent essay on civil disobedience resulted from the single night he spent in jail for failing to pay his poll tax in support of the wicked American war in Mexico. This said, he was arrested by his friend, Sheriff Sam Staples, and they spent much of the afternoon playing checkers by a window before eating a hearty dinner and retiring to bed. However, following the American Civil War, immigration from Europe radically changed Concord's population, especially in the poorer parts of Concord Junction. And in 1872, Concord experienced its first racial riot. This was the first beginning of a notion that Concord was going to change, and we needed to figure a way to be better together. The Concord selectmen decided to limit the Middlesex Sheriff's Department to serving warrants and auctioning off debtors' property, and to create a two-man police department with Irish immigrant Edwin Smith policing the immigrants of West Concord, and a native-born white Protestant officer serving the needs of Concord Center. And we, from that period, have two very distinct cultures in Concord. One that traces its heritage back, for the most part, to the founders and the early English settlers, and then West Concord, which traces its heritage primarily back to the immigrant culture. When in 1875 Massachusetts was seeking a location for a new state prison, while it reconstructed its inhumane Charles Street jail, Concord offered the old Cumming estate at the edge of West Concord, which perhaps could offer more humane incarceration conditions while helping to lift West Concord's enormous poverty. Concord State Prison opened in May 1878 with 700 inmates and 40 prison guards. At a time when white working class men might hope to earn $800 a year, these prison guards were paid $1,200 a year, making them one of the most solid parts of the West Concord working class community. 5 years later, with the Charles Street renovations complete, Boston wanted these good working class jobs back. So the legislature moved most of the prisoners and guards back to Boston, but it agreed to keep Concord open as a reformatory for white male prisoners under the age of 30 who could be released once they had been reformed. The Concord Reformatory at that time had a hospital, a dining room, a chapel, a library, a laundry, and a barber shop. Not too much different from Newbury Court. During the day, inmates learned a trade: blacksmithing, carpentry, printing, tinsmithing, and the making of harnesses, shoes, and hats were among the available choices. In the evenings, prisoners signed up for academic classes, including basic literacy, chemistry, French, and architectural drawing. The goal was when they left the prison that they would have a trade and they could go back and work into society. By 1890, Concord's population had grown to 4,435 residents, nearly a third of them living in West Concord, and over half of those connected to the prison. Attending Protestant worship, Bible study, and prayer groups was seen as an important way to show one's readiness to be reformed and rejoin the broader society. So Reverend William Batt was selected as the Protestant chaplain for the Concord Reformatory in 1885. And for the next 25 years, he would lead services in the prison, baptize both prisoners and guards in the nearby Warner Pond, and be the spiritual leader of this prison community. He began holding ecumenical Protestant worship services in Warner Hall for prisoners, guards, and local residents as a way to prepare prisoners to resume their proper place in society. When we talk about the importance of Warner Pond in our history, we need to remember that there were a number of people who were baptized there that as a pathway back to being productive members of society. In 1890, 13 women and 4 men founded the West Concord Union Church, WCUC, a short walk from the prison. Many of the men and most of the women's husbands worked at the prison as officers, guards, and engineers. Lucy Dodge, who was one of the founding members, was a dressmaker and was the mother-in-law of Charles Hart, the prison superintendent. And some of the wealthiest benefactors of this new Protestant congregation were manufacturers who employed prison labor in making their products, including Harvey Wheeler, who owned the Boston Harness Company, and Mr. Damon, who owned the Damon Mill. 2 of the Roman Catholic religious instructors at the prison also contributed as well, so that it was a broad community effort to say, how do we bring religion back to the core of this incarceration community? The superintendent and deputy superintendent of the prison lived in large, luxurious houses just outside the prison, where they entertained visiting dignitaries, friends, and the local community on holidays, and even prisoners and guards for special events. You may know that the rail trail we have, the reformatory rail trail that comes past Great Meadows and makes its way over to along the Assabat, ended terminus now where the Concord Rotary is. And they had so many visitors coming, they built a hotel with a wonderful diner there so that the visitors could have a place to stay when they came to check out this model reformatory. J.F. Scott, the next superintendent of the reformatory, was chosen as the first president of the West Concord Union Religious Society. And I'm told that boys played baseball in the field on the other side of the prison. And the Union Baseball Club, who played on that field, became one of the finest in Concord, with particular struggle to see who could hit a home run that cleared the prison wall. Upon returning home, a retired guard might return his son's baseball with congratulations. They held dances and social events with the prison a major factor in West Concord's social life. It was a very important part of Concord in that period, late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It's part of what lifted West Concord up from being a very poor immigrant neighborhood where everybody you knew was poor, to being more of a middle-class society. It was a model reformatory attracting visitors from around the country. Every week, the West Concord newspaper covered prison news and gossip, including biographical details of every new arrival, what offense he had served, and the length of his sentence. Some inmates were employed by West Concord's manufacturers. The reformatory had 18 horses, 150 cows, 3,000 chickens, and 500 pigs. So even a city boy could learn how to work on a farm if that's what they wanted to do. Concord's West Union Church was begun to support the Protestant prison staff and Our Lady Roman Catholic Church subsequently supported the growing number of Irish immigrant inmates. By 1887, 1/3 of Concord's residents, including in the prison, were Irish, and Father John Crow, assistant pastor at St. Bernard's, was elected as the first Irish person to Concord's school committee. In 1888, the prison's deputy superintendent was elected to Concord's school committee, being the first Irishman from the West Concord. And in 1902, 3 wives of reformatory officers established the West Concord Women's Club and Society. The prison in many ways was the heart of West Concord. By 1916, the eve of the First World War, the West Concord Union Church was the largest Protestant congregation in Concord, surpassing temporarily Concord's first parish Unitarian, Trinitarian Congregational, and Trinity Episcopal in terms of active membership. They called Reverend Alfred Stone, a direct descendant of Concord's founder, Reverend Peter Bulkley, as well as a descendant of Concord's founding Wheeler family, which owned many of the farms and manufacturers of West Concord, to be their new senior minister. The prison continued to be the biggest employer in Concord and its largest single group of residents. Protestant men continued to hold most of the senior positions at the prison, but increasingly the newer guards were Irish Catholics. By 1925, West Concord's James Nagel became the first person of Irish descent to be elected to Concord's Board of Selectmen, but the times were rapidly changing. The 1919 flu epidemic hit Concord Junction very hard, and especially its nearly 1,000 prisoners and guards. Over the next year, over a quarter of the West Concord population, housed often in disease-ridden close quarters under unsanitary conditions, would die of flu or related diseases. People in Concord Center would not risk entering West Concord because of the flu. And even people living in West Concord gave the prison a wide berth because of the high death rate in the prison. The 1920s saw the rise of the new Ku Klux Klan, burning crosses in the neighborhood. The John Birch Society, the Boston Watch and Ward Society, all anti-immigrant white supremacy societies. And it started in this period that Concord started talking about, I've been here for 12 generations, I've been here for 14 generations, the way to certify that I truly belong in Concord. I'm not so sure about you. Unfortunately, you still hear that when people run for office here in town. The popularity of eugenics among Concord's educated elite led to declining relations between ethnic classes. People started to have lack of relationships so that they grew bigotries and preconceived notions of each other, which could easily be cured if they could have crossed those lines. Concord's local jail was generally used to imprison local people who, from marginalized groups such as the transients, addicts, debtors, and the poor. The state-run prisons incarcerated serious criminals, addicts, and thieves who were often unable to survive outside of the prison system. The ethnic makeup of the prison population shifted over decades to reflect the changing makeup of the urban, desperately poor, and the violent and criminal nature of their existence. Thus, what were mostly uneducated, destitute young Irish men in 1900, at different times saw influxes of other European oppressed minorities, especially poor Jewish immigrants, then African Americans from the Deep South, then Hispanic immigrants, and other groups. You can almost trace the pattern of immigration, and the disappointment comes when they can't find a job, they can't accommodate themselves to society, and they become part of the prison population here in Concord. During the Great Depression, Concord's prison population soared, but almost none of the inmates were from Concord, but rather from the inner city's desperate poor. Concord, like most smaller towns, took pride in caring for its own poor and destitute, but no longer viewed these prisoners as residents of Concord. So these were an alien element in our midst, criminals to be feared. When during World War II, Concord farmers faced a shortage of field workers, they did not turn to Concord prison inmates to provide able-bodied workers, as they had done during World War I, but rather they made a deal with the military to bring German prisoners of war by railroad every morning from Fort Devon's German POW camp. And the reports from the farmers were that these were the best workers they'd ever had. But it says something about the cultural exchange. After World War II and the growing migration to northern cities of poor African Americans escaping the Jim Crow South, the ethnic mix of prisoners and the condition of their imprisonment shifted once again. They tore down the white houses opposite the prison for fear that a marksman standing in an upstairs room could shoot directly into the guard towers. No longer were neighborhood boys able to play ball by the prison or hit home runs over the walls, because razor wire was added to make the prison impregnable to attack from either within or without. In the second half of the 20th century, Concord's prison became far more penal than reformatory, and the social distance between the prison guards and prisoners became sharply more pronounced, and treatment of prisoners reflected that trend. Concord's prison became more violent, with greater use of solitary confinement as a behavioral penalty, and increasingly inmates were members of ethnic or criminal gangs in the inner city. While before World War II, gangs of prisoners were associated with the Irish Mafia or other ethnically oriented immigrant groups, after World War II, the toughest groups were often African American gangs, displaced from the South by the Great Migration. Malcolm Little was incarcerated at Concord MCI, where he was radicalized, becoming Malcolm X, a prominent black Muslim scholar, preacher, and fundraiser. And his story is not unique. It reflects that period. What had begun as an aspirational reformatory to help poor white immigrants assimilate into American culture had over 100 years become a dumping ground for violent, mostly black and Hispanic men, many of whom the white police officers and prison guards would be happy to never see return to civil society. Even as the prison's 100-year-old buildings deteriorated, with growing deferred maintenance issues and gang culture radicalized many of its inmates, growing racism and cultural differences made incarceration a horrific experience for all involved. Armed working-class white men, who themselves could no longer afford to live anywhere near Concord, beat and harassed these men of color, marginalized by society, some convicted for life imprisonment, oftentimes with no clear evidence that they actually were guilty. The recidivism rate soared as these broken men were ill-equipped for modern American life after spending decades of their lives under inhumane conditions. The percent of Concord's prison population with diagnosable mental illness grew dramatically after Massachusetts closed its hospitals and sanitariums for the mentally ill. Over the next 50 years, as people living with alcohol and drug addictions often fell outside the law, the percentage of inmates suffering from treatable addictions surpassed 50% of all inmates. The percentage living with untreated trauma, which has never been properly tracked, appears to have been much higher. In the 1960s, Timothy Leary, a Harvard professor, conducted the Concord prison experiment to lower recidivism among 32 inmates soon to be released from prison. In addition to administration of LSD in controlled circumstances, it included group psychotherapy and a post-parole model based on Alcoholics Anonymous. Its initial results reduced 6-month recidivism from 64%, or nearly 2/3 of the people within 6 months after they leave prison, to 25%. But the Massachusetts Correctional Institute failed to fund the program beyond the 6-month trial period, and many of the men subsequently failed and ended up back in prison. Later studies could not replicate Leary's results, and as the 60s went on, LSD fell further into disrepute. So prison reformation was replaced by greater punishment, as these men were deemed unsalvageable, and they would be serving longer and longer terms for the same crimes. When Concord MCI was built in 1873, it was a model prison, bringing good jobs to West Concord, as white working-class men watched over and guarded mostly white working-class immigrants. By its 100th anniversary in 1973, it had become a much more violent institution, with underpaid white working-class guards, many of whom had addictions and or mental health issues, guarding poor men of color with addictions and or mental health issues. It was an overcrowded and cruel community, with almost none of its employees or inmates having any significant Concord connection. In 1973, it housed 400 inmates, but by the year 2000, its inmates had tripled to 1,300, and more than the prison was ever built for. And the average prison term had more than doubled, especially for the men of color. As the war on drugs became a war on poor people of color, for the first time, Concord MCI had to deal with significant prison riots. These men placed under inhumane conditions for long periods of time were more likely to riot than those who had a prospect to ever return to normal society. In the early 1970s, Concord became embroiled in a controversy over prisoner voting rights. The Concord Correctional Resource Group was founded to empower prisoners and promote better communication between the town and the prison, with hopes that this would reduce recidivism. A district court ruling declared that as residents of Concord, prisoners had the right as anybody else to vote in local as well as state and federal elections. If you could vote in the elections as someone who was here studying in school, you ought to be able to do it if you're here in prison. A prisoner, Carl Valeka, announced his intention then to run for selectman. Being eligible for furlough due to good behavior, several church communities welcomed him into their pulpits. Those who feared the criminal element in town ran a very active campaign against him, and he lost by a wide margin. No one ever attempted that again. The West Concord Union Church connections to the prison was now mostly gone. Only a handful of church members were employed at the prison, and increasingly having a medium security prison in the neighborhood was a drag on property values. It was less and less feasible for a prison guard to afford to live in Concord, so WCUC quietly ended its evening worship services and classes aimed at Concord prison officers living locally. Prison reform became a popular topic, though some members and many prison guards were critical of outreach to violent criminals and or exposing their wives and children to such people. Yet Concord communities of faith still sought to have some outreach to the prison in our midst. So First Parish Unitarian Universalist, Trinity Congregational, and Trinity Episcopal created a task force from which emerged the Concord Prison Outreach. They began offering programs in 1986 so inmates could learn English as a second language, earn their GED high school equivalency, or participate in discussion groups and art classes. From its founding, Concord's prison had a furlough program for well-behaved, nonviolent incarcerated men to help prepare them to re-enter society upon completing their prison terms. In 1988, Willie Horton committed a brutal crime while on furlough from Concord's prison, which George Bush used in campaign ads to beat Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis in that year's presidential election. The parole board slammed the door on furloughs and most paroles, and the culture at Concord MCI became more violent as recidivism soared. An inner-city school-to-prison pipeline evolved during the 1990s, which sent many underclassed juveniles repeatedly through the incarceration system, often for the same crimes that juveniles in the suburbs might commit, but without the same dire consequences. Concord, like many similar suburbs, developed an informal alternative sentencing protocol for Concord youth. A nonviolent first offender might simply receive a warning from the Concord police while notifying their parents. And many of them thought that was over-punishment. A more serious or repeat offender would be required to come with their parents to meet with the chief of police, who would agree suitable punishment with them. In all cases, the goal was to terminate criminal behavior without the life-destroying impact of the official judiciary system. Such informal arrangements were not available in the inner city. With changing views of drug-related convictions, Concord's MCI's prisoner population was already in decline before COVID, and the impact of COVID-related measures and deaths has accelerated that decline. The inmate population has over 20 years fallen from the 1,300 inmates at its peak to 300 inmates, well below the economic capacity of the 50-plus acre campus and multiple old buildings, with an estimated $100 million of deferred maintenance to be required to continue to function as a humane penal institution. So Governor Healy recently announced that Concord MCI would close effective June 30th, 2024, with the remaining inmates assigned to other underutilized Massachusetts prisons. Sam Williams, Executive Director of Concord Prison Outreach, himself a formerly incarcerated man, has said CPO will continue to serve inmates in 8 Massachusetts penal institutions, serving thousands of incarcerated men and women. Concord can take pride in its role in helping to make the penal incarceration system in Massachusetts a little bit more humane for 150 years, while now preparing to utilize the former prison site in West Concord to better meet the evolving needs of the people of Concord for affordable housing of a wide variety of types, as well as commercial and light industrial uses. It's been a long and interesting journey, and the journey continues. Perhaps the next chapter will be one we can be equally proud of as a kind and caring community. It turns out because of the prison closing, I was with Sam Williams earlier this week inside the Brav unit at Concord MCI for what had begun as a CPO-sponsored Easter celebration for a small group of inmates and their families. The Brav unit is the remaining vestige of Concord's attempt of reforming young men. These are men between the ages of 19 and 26 when they're first incarcerated, so that they can reclaim and reform their lives when they re-enter society. It is perhaps the most humane section of the prison, with a friendlier and more diverse group of guards watching over them and the CPO volunteers, yet the remaining 20 remaining inmates are all men of color, while most guards, despite recent recruitment of women and minorities, are still largely white working-class men whose jobs are negotiated and protected by their union. For the most part, the problem isn't the people, either prison staff or prisoners. Most are decent people who you would be happy to have as your neighbors. Yet the prison environment itself is dehumanizing and brutal. First, to visit, you must submit all your personal information: social security number, passport, driver's license, telephone number, email address, father's name, mother's maiden name, and home address, so that you can be scanned for complete referral to see whether or not you are eligible to get visiting privileges. Imagine being somebody who has got a prison record or is here undocumented, and what we're doing to these families, where we're basically saying, unless you can provide all this information, we're not going to allow you into the prison. On arrival, visitors are instructed to leave anything of value: wallets, cell phones, jewelry, and watches locked in your car. Dressing inappropriately with open shoes or work boots, ripped clothing or denim, or showing too much skin, or potentially political or gang-related items can lead to revocation of your visiting privileges and being sent home. After signing in, you surrender your driver's license in return for an escorted visitor pass. The waiting room resembles a very down-in-the-dumps bus terminal, which provides small paid lockers for anything you didn't leave in your car, such as a pen or a pencil or car key. There are no working clocks anywhere in that first part of the prison, so you lose all track of time and everything routinely runs late. However, you need to stay ready, for if you're not ready when the guard comes to get you for further processing, you can be left to wait much longer. Then you undergo an electronic and physical search that makes airport security like a silly joke. Clothing, belts, and shoes searched for any hidden weapons or wires. You pass through a series of small doors, with each door locked behind you before the one in front of you can be opened. During all of this, you are guarded. When we finally got to the institutionally harsh Brav unit community room, having spent an hour or more to traverse the 100 yards from the entrance to the community room, there were 3 clearly distinguishable groups in the room. The guards were the biggest group, and they didn't tend to socialize with the prisoners or their families, but were eager to talk to the volunteers about how unsettling the closing of Concord MCI and relocation of their jobs were for them. The volunteers were the second biggest group, and despite their goodwill expressed just by being there, many of the less experienced volunteers looked clearly uncomfortable in this institutional setting, almost as if they might forget and not let us out. The prisoners seemed the most at ease, enjoying the visit with their loved ones, especially the fathers of young children, and a chance to be talked to and treated like human beings. There was pizza and soft drinks, chips, cookies, and fresh fruit, a long line of tables set with paintbrushes, crayons, and coloring books for children to color. I spoke with some of the incarcerated young men and their families, all of whom were people of color and unfailingly well-spoken and respectful. These were not the young men that television had taught me to expect. Except for the grace of God, they could have been my brothers or me in a less racist world. I spoke with some of the corrections officers, and though generally less well-spoken and respectful than the incarcerated men, they were much like the fathers lined up along the sidelines of any middle-class sporting event. They have degrees in criminal justice and are often ex-military or ex-police officers. And it has recently been announced that much of Concord's Brav unit will be moved intact to the prison in Gardner, where most of CPO's programs can continue and their culture can be maintained. For the most part, the guards were focused upon what the impact would be on their commutes and their families, rather than giving any thought to how much less reachable Gardner may be for Boston or Lowell families to visit their loved ones. It reflects our beliefs about who is important, who is valued, how do we make decisions, and what do we owe these incarcerated men, and what outcomes are we seeking. Like any metropolitan area, Concord has made different choices over the decades and centuries about how it practices our law enforcement. When we tend to view our incarcerated neighbor as we would ourselves, we tend to treat them much better. And in fact, under such conditions, crime generally declines and the marginalized and oppressed can begin to flourish. When we tend to fear incarcerated men as unredeemable misfits, addicts, mentally ill and criminally inclined, social discontents, these inhumane institutions of incarceration can tend to make them so. So what do we truly owe them? What do we truly owe ourselves? It's worth thinking about what kind of society we wish to be and how do we hope to get there. I know I choose a greater focus on reformation and less on penal incarceration, not only for the good of the prisoners, but for the good for all of us and our children. Thank you. We have a microphone here to pass around, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
So Jim, is this on?
It's on.
So Jim, what do you think are the major factors of the turn from the reform attitude to a penal attitude? What do you think, where should we look to understand that?
It happens in Concord following World War II. The Boston and Massachusetts, like most urban centers, did not like having all of these desperately poor former slaves moving up from the South to get out of the Jim Crow South. It shook the idea that we were all a homogeneous culture and everybody was treated well. And so when we see the prison expands dramatically, that's when racism becomes a much bigger issue. It's odd enough that when we were incarcerating Protestant immigrants, white Protestant immigrants, we found white Protestant men to guard them. When we started incarcerating Irish Catholic immigrants, we found Irish Catholic people to guard them and to make sure that they could keep their families somewhat intact and keep their sense of self. When we added Black Muslims, that all went away. They withdrew support for a lot of the programs, and the conversations around the prisons became distinctly more racist. It's partly a result of the eugenics movement of 125 years ago, when it was very common in Concord. Agassiz, who was one of the original formulators of the eugenics movement at Harvard, was a close personal friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and would often come and speak at Concord's Lyceum about the Anglo-Saxon race's superiority.
I may have missed this in your talk, but what's the role of the farm community that's adjacent to it? What's going to happen to that?
It's going to stay. It's become gradually a good place for young men to spend the last time in prison in a lower security environment. So they're going to keep the farm. They're going to perhaps expand it out. We don't know yet until we see how all the reassignments went. But none of the men inside Concord MCI are eligible to go to the farm yet. So they're being reallocated to primarily 3 different prisons.
I had a question about comments on the war on drugs and how that affected Concord.
So the war on drugs, as we all know, made certain assumptions. And I was at Yale in the early 70s, where our drug use was much higher as undergraduates at Yale than it was in the inner city of New Haven. And yet 90% of the people who went to jail for drugs in New Haven were in the inner city of New Haven. You also probably seen the statistics where if you use the middle class form of cocaine, then you've got a lesser sentence than if you use the cheaper crack cocaine, which is essentially doing the same thing, but gets you twice the sentence.
Hi. Can you tell us, can you please explain to us, within the administration of the penal system, who has a role with some of the attitudes that you clearly show?
the little-known Governor's Council is a key piece. And when we vote on who goes on the Governor's Council, we don't really think about that, but they have to approve all of the people on the parole board. So when the parole board changed their attitude, it really would have been the Governor's Council that would have said, yes, that's fine, or no, let's keep the current system, which works well to reduce reincarceration. The correctional institution, Massachusetts Correctional Institute, operates pretty much obscurely. It's hard to know how they're making decisions that they're making. But what everybody in the system knows is there's certain prisons that are far more humane than others. And Concord had a reputation as being the worst of the worst in Massachusetts. Now that we've gotten rid of that, the next one in line is the women's prison in Framingham, which is in really horrible shape. And until recently, the director of that prison, the superintendent of that prison, basically thought that women that were in her care didn't need to be coddled. And so basically refused a lot of the programs we were offering from Concord Prison Outreach. Fortunately, somebody seems to have stepped in somewhere. And again, it's obscure, so it's not hard to know why. But one of the women in the Correctional Institute that has got a reputation for helping women keep their sense of sanity until they can get back with their children is now the head of that program. And she basically has turned to Concord Prison Outreach and says, come in, we want you here. Our most successful program at Concord MCI over the last several years has been Read to Me Daddy, where we basically record these young fathers reading a story to their children and then can take that record and let them play it at night for their children. She basically, the previous prisoner said she didn't understand why women would want to do that. The new program's coming in, it's going to Read to Me Mommy, it's going to be launched by September.
So I have a question about the Old Cumming estate. I think you said 1875.
Yep.
Is that the mansion that we see?
Yes.
That's okay. My question is, prior to that, was there not a jail in Concord Center, maybe across from the tavern?
Yes. The jail moved around over time. At one point, it's right behind where the Catholic Rectory is, not where the little marker is for Thoreau's night in jail. It was actually a little further up, but it was too swampy, so they put the marker where it was convenient. But it was also over behind the banks for a long time. But they generally tended to connect the jails since they had to provide hospitality for their cellmates attached to taverns or hotels. So it's the Middlesex Hotel, which was at the jail over across from the tavern.
Jim, is it still true that women, when they are in prison and in labor, they are restrained throughout the birthing?
I can't speak to that from personal experience. But Sam has these incredible stories about how the system has been established to dehumanize the people who are in the system, with somehow the notion that will scare them straight or remove the criminal elements from our society. And that's all been so disproven at this point. Treating people kindly and humanely while making sure that they are punished if they've done something that should be punished seems to have a far better result for everybody involved.
I was curious about, all that history, were women in the 1700s and 1800s punished in some way, going to a certain jail?
They were punished by being chattel of the men. They weren't allowed to sign a banknote. They weren't allowed to have independent income. They weren't allowed to vote. So they couldn't do the things that would be the things the men were going to jail for. That's the good news and the bad news.
No women could do those things, but.
Right, so there were a few women who did not have a man attached to them, who were destitute. And so they would take them into the jail, and then they would hold an auction And it's a reverse auction. Who will charge the jail the least money to take this woman and take care of her?
Jim, at one point you mentioned the change in the mental health or conditions with the Massachusetts hospitals, Bridgewater, and there was other hospitals, I guess, that the state closed down. Is there any effort to recognize the mental health needs these days and how that interacts with criminal behavior?
It's disappointingly not inside the prison system. Hopefully, outside with the homeless, there's more of a recognition that there's ways to intercede. The major problem appears to have been that having had no way to treat people, all you could do was incarcerate them. Then we get the treatments coming along. And we discovered that under a well-regulated environment, many of these mental health issues could be managed. And so they looked and said, okay, we've got drugs now. We've solved this problem. So you put the people back out on the street, and it's no longer the well-regulated management of their disease. So they end up back in the incarceration system. And you're not allowed to take any of these treatments into the prison.
I don't think that's true, just I don't think that's true. They can get mental health meds. Sometimes there's a more restricted list that they might not be able to get the brand that works best for them.
Can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
If they're not in the care of a physician, it's nearly impossible for them to get those meds.
Wow. That I did a study just 2 years ago, looking at prison services. That did not come out.
So
Did
when
you
you
talk to
introduce who
Christmas?
you are, yeah, so there-
I'm Wendy Holt. I'm friends with some people here, and I work as a consultant in mental health and substance use disorders, and we were comparing the services available in the prisons to those available through Medicaid, which is a very comprehensive system. And they did fall short, but that aspect was not disclosed. There is a state prison for people with mental illness, and presumably they can get a very broad range of
Yes.
psychotropic meds there. That the difficulty is they're still not treated as well as they should be, and hopefully the legislature's been very frustrated with the lack of
Right.
accountability in the prison system,
And
hopefully.
things are better than they were. But it's still very hard if you're incarcerated to get the help you need if you weren't already in somebody's care before you were put into the prison system. But you're right, the special units that focus on
Yeah.
addicts are doing a much better job than the other parts of the prison.
Well, on the same line of services being hard to get to, I think it was Sam who told us we were trying, when he talked to us a couple of years ago, we were trying to get maybe some education programs where we could do some teaching or reading or tutoring or whatever. And as what we found out was that the unions were not letting people that were volunteers, and that seems like a real shame. I mean, it won't affect us now because in Concord, but it does seem. What do you know about what that is and what's going on?
It's not the unions, it's the administration, the correctional administration. And as I say, different superintendents have different reputations in the system. And it's really hard to figure out in an obscure system, how do you get out the people who have a strictly penal approach to things to bias it back towards the ones who have more of a reform approach. But when you offer someone GED chances to earn your GED, you're doing some significant benefit for them. If you say, no, they shouldn't be able to get their GED because of whatever reason, that they've misbehaved and you've now put them in solitary or whatever, the use of solitary confinement in Massachusetts has gone up dramatically, which is also very hard to figure out how do you prepare people for transitioning when you're busy punishing them.
I think Andrew.
Jim, we've seen a real surge in restorative justice as another way of hopefully not introducing somebody into the prison system.
Right.
What do you think the future of that is, and do you think that has played a role in any of this decline?
I think it has. I think it's the direction we're headed as we start viewing these as human beings who are part of our community, that we want to try and figure out how to treat them justly, but humanely. And we're going to see more of that going on. Within the context of telling all the bad news of what the 300 years of history's been, there's the positive note that our prison population in Massachusetts has dropped by half over the last 20 years.
Jim, could you say more about the use of isolation here in Massachusetts?
Right. We now have very good data that human beings, which were social beings, if you lock them up for a month, 2 months, with no real contact with other people, that I'd go crazy. But a lot of them seem to have real trauma effects of extended periods in solitary confinement. If I went a day without hugs, I would go crazy.
Hi. I'm wondering what we could do with just being here. What's our role? What can I do? It's horrible. I volunteered for 16 years teaching art at
Right.
the farm, and I can validate much of what you said.
Right.
And I'm just horrified. I didn't know the history, and I feel helpless sitting here. And is there something any of us is?
The first thing we can all do is bear witness. Lift up what really happened and don't sugarcoat it. Don't be defensive about it. We didn't do this. But our society was built on a certain way of treating people that is abhorrent. The second thing that we can all do, if you're so inclined, is to support the new programs, whether it's Concord Prison Outreach and their programs to connect young parents with their kids, or whether it's the restorative justice programs that find alternative means. I was quite taken to discover that we've done restorative justice in Concord for 50 years for Concord citizens and their children, but not for people who got picked up while driving through Concord, that they go into the penal system. The third thing we can do, those of us who have the ability to some gift, whether it's teaching art classes or teaching English as a second language, and are willing to put ourselves a little bit at risk into these communities, can certainly help. And it comes that it's great to be able to help somebody learn a language or a skill that they need. But having 1 hour a week with somebody who treats you like a humane human being, who matters, who has worth, does so much psychologically for your ability to cope with the world that just, I'm a theologian. I would love to see a buddy system where everybody who gets assigned to prison gets somebody who is focused on them and an advocate for them while they're going through the prison system. But I think that's so far beyond imagining that it's going to be another lifetime.
Jim, you mentioned the prison system has been cut in half in the past 20 years. Could you please talk about what happened and why, and where do you see it going?
It basically was a lot of the people who were scooped up from the inner city poor in the war on drugs, where they were nonviolent offenses, first-time offenses, and under mandatory sentencing laws, were put in for relatively long sentences. And there's been a move to have the parole board say if they then behave well for 5 years in prison, that we're gonna let them back out. And it's always a double-edged sword. You saw it in the Globe this morning, where it's reporting that somebody who was in prison for a 25-year sentence is being let go after 7. You go, is that a good idea? I have no idea, but hopefully the parole board has a good idea. That this is not likely to be someone who's dangerous, is what they've concluded. But it also helps that we have, as was indicated, separate kinds of imprisonment. With Concord MCI, there's, as I'm told, 5 or 6 different kinds of prisoners, and the most violent ones tend to not even be at Concord MCI. But the most violent ones at Concord MCI are almost all sex offenders. And so how you treat a sex offender and how you treat someone who was selling marijuana on the street should be radically different in terms of how do you psychologically help them get to where they can get to.
I have a friend who fosters dogs, puppies, who have been sent to the prisons for the prisoners to work with and train, and it appears to be tremendously successful. That was in New York. Is there any chance of anything like that happening around here?
I've never heard anyone suggest it. But Simon Cataldo is wonderful. So raise it up with Simon, and he may put it into the list of things he's working on.
Do they have training of guide dogs right here at the farm?
Yeah.
They do.
I think they do.
But that's different from having a companion animal while you're in prison. If you can't have a buddy system where you've got everybody adopts a human buddy, having an animal buddy would be nearly as good.
Well, I think our hour is up, and this has been terrific. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So bear witness. Tell people you talk to that this is what really happened, and it's getting better.